Welcome to part 2 of writing first chapters. Okay, so if you guys missed it, I had a video last week or the week before that. Don't really know how long it's going to take me to edit this video, but last video was about creating your first chapter. So like where to begin, creating your rough draft. This video specifically is about perfecting that, okay? So this video isn't really to overwhelm you guys. If you don't have your first chapter, I don't expect you to go into this thinking, I need to write something perfect, okay? So you do need to watch that video or at least have some kind of rough draft of what your first chapter is going to be before you jump into this video about perfecting your first chapter. And to be completely honest, this isn't gonna make your first chapter perfect, okay? Nothing is gonna make your first chapter perfect because there's no such thing as a perfect first chapter. We're just gonna be talking about how to make it stand out, how to feel more like a professional first chapter, how to really catch people's attention, okay? So that's what we're gonna be talking about today. I was really struggling with writing my first chapter recently, so I sat down and I read a bunch of first chapters just to try to get an idea of how they work and why they work. So for today's video, I took all the notes that I compiled after reading all those first chapters, the bad and the good, and I created 4 different lessons that I would consider important to making your first chapter perfect. Quote, perfect. Now again, this is the 4 things that stood out to me, something that I think really perfect first chapters. It may not work for you, and if it doesn't, I always say, toss it out the window, but if it does, write it down, keep it in your notes. Who knows, it might come up later. So let's jump into this with lesson 1. I decided to start off lesson 1 with where to begin, because that's the ultimate question, right? When you're sitting down to really write your first chapter is where do you begin? Now, I assume you already have a rough draft of your chapter. So we're not talking about where to begin when you actually start writing those few words, but we're talking about after you've written that first chapter, is where you started a good place to start? Now, I can't give you a clear-cut answer here because ultimately, it comes down to you as a writer and your story and how it all works. But I can give you a few different bits of advice that helps you narrow down where you might want to start your story. The first thing you want to look at is where does your narrative begin? Not your story, but your narrative. And by narrative, I mean the point in the story where your character's life changes and they start heading down their path to the end goal. Most of the time, this is the inciting incident in a story. For Spider-Man, it's getting bit by the spider. For Harry, it's getting his letter to Hogwarts. For Katniss, it's volunteering for the games. For Frodo, it's getting the ring that he now has to carry to Mordor. In Avatar, it's Katara and Sokka finding Aang. This is the moment that your character is pushed into their narrative. This is the moment the story begins, but it's not the moment your book begins. Most of the time, stories start at a moment that leads to the inciting incident. Spider-Man's story opens up with him on a field trip that leads to him getting bit by the genetically modified spider. Frodo's story begins during his uncle's birthday, in which his uncle finally gives up his ring and gives it to Frodo. And in Avatar, it was Katara and Sokka out fishing for their tribe when Katara accidentally breaks an iceberg and finds Aang. Now, for Harry Potter and Hunger Games, their scenes don't directly lead to the inciting incident, but the scenes that we see happen are what makes the inciting incident more impactful. If we didn't know that Harry was mistreated by his aunt and uncle, finding out that he was going to be a wizard and move to Hogwarts wouldn't have meant as much. And for Katniss, if we didn't know she was this person who worked so hard to feed her family and care for her family, volunteering for the Hunger Games wouldn't have made much sense to us. Some stories skip this entirely and start right at the inciting incident. On a hairpin turn above the dead forest, on no day in particular, a white Toyota crashed into a black Mercedes, for a moment blending into a blur of gray. Everlost, Chapter 1. This story jumps right into the inciting incident, and it is so much fun. I love this story. But it does this because everything that happened before this moment didn't really matter. It didn't matter who the people were in the cars. All that matters is what happened after the cars crashed. It's completely up to you how far back you trace your story before the inciting incident. If who your character is before the inciting incident really matters, then show us that. But if it doesn't matter at all to the story that happens beyond, then perhaps think about taking it out completely and just starting right there in the change. The biggest mistake that I see in stories is starting too far back from the inciting incident and having none of it matter. If you read a lot of books, you probably know what I'm talking about, and honestly, you've probably wrote a chapter or two like this. I definitely have, where your character wakes up, they wander down the stairs, they say hi to their family, and they leave for school, most likely being late. I don't know why they're always late. And none of this has to do with the inciting incident. It's just to show us who the character is before they change. But since they're acting as a normal child in a normal school, we don't really need to be told any of this. And honestly, books are starting to get more creative nowadays. So instead of starting with them waking up, we're now starting in a magical world with them walking down the street, or maybe they're hunting in the magical forest. So many books start with characters hunting nowadays, but none of it has to do with the inciting incident, and therefore it's boring. We don't care about it. If it doesn't matter to the overall narrative, then leave it out. And this ties nicely into lesson 2. Lesson 2 is about making every moment count. So to give you an idea of what I'm talking about here, let's look at 2 different paragraphs from 2 different books. The Warrior Heir, Chapter 1. Jack, his mother's voice cut into his dreams, and he reluctantly opened his eyes. It was late, he could tell. The light had lost that early morning watercolor quality and streamed boldly through the window. He stayed up too late the night before, stargazing. It was the night of the new moon, and some of the key constellations hadn't slid over the horizon until after midnight. "Coming," he shouted. "Almost ready," he lied as his feet hit the wood floor. His jeans lay in a heap next to the bed, where he stepped out of them the night before. He jerked them on, pulled a fresh t-shirt from the drawer, and threw a pair of socks over his shoulder. Hunger Games, Chapter 1. When I wake up, the other side of the bed is cold. My fingers stretch out, seeking Prim's warmth, but finding only the rough canvas cover of the mattress. She must have had bad dreams and climbed in with our mother. Of course she did. This is the day of the reaping. The first book spends its time explaining the color of the sun, which has no relevance to the story or the scene. It then explains the character and how he loves to stargaze, which I would give it props for, other than it has nothing to do with the rest of the story whatsoever. And then we're given an entire sentence of how he puts on his clothes and runs down the stairs. Honestly, this paragraph takes way too many words and sentences to just tell us he likes to stargaze and he's almost late for school. And that's it. That's the only information we get out of this paragraph. And honestly, these things aren't important to the narrative. Now in Hunger Games, we had half the amount of words, but double or triple the information. We see that Prim is someone that she really cares for and finds comfort in. We see that her living situation isn't great because of the rough canvas of the mattress. And then we get a hint at the upcoming danger, the reaping. The first chapter of Warrior Heir is 30 pages of almost all useless information, other than we find out that weird things happen when he doesn't take his medicine. And even after this, we have more chapters of useless things happening. While Hunger Games is 18 pages of world building and character building before the reaping happens. Now, I'm not saying that fewer pages is better in this situation. All I'm saying is that do make sure that what you're saying has to do with the narrative and has a point to the story. Try finding a way to show your character and your world in as few paragraphs as possible. If one of the qualities of your character is that they're an engineer, we'll start off the chapter with them building something. If they're a great thief, start with them stealing something. If your character lives a pretty unextraordinary life, then don't waste time telling me about it. One of my favorite beginnings is from Scythe by Neil Shusterman. Now, this book is set in a futuristic world where an AI god basically rules the planet, and everyone lives forever, but overpopulation is a problem, so they have scythes to kill those people off. This is how the first chapter goes. The scythe arrived late on a cold November afternoon. Citra was at the dining room table, slaving over a particularly difficult algebra problem, shuffling variables, unable to solve for x or y, when this new and far more pernicious variable entered her life's equation. In one paragraph, this story does what Warrior's Heir does in 30 pages. It establishes that our main character lives a mundane life that isn't interesting in any way, and something interesting happens that changes it. We don't need to be shown that Citra wakes up and goes to school and eats with her family like a normal teenager, because we can already assume that. I think this part is actually really difficult for a lot of writers, because It's easy for us to write about our character waking up and going to school because we've done it so many times ourselves. Trying to think up an interesting beginning that you've never seen before when you don't even have a complete story is hard, and I completely understand that. Because of this, I don't want you to be scared to write that bad beginning, because writing that bad beginning still has its uses. It's easy to write. There's no pressure. You'll get to know your character more and what motivates them and how the story really should go. And then you can go back and rework that first paragraph once you have a better understanding of what your story should be. Because until we actually start writing down those awful beginnings, we don't really know who our character is or what they're doing or why they're doing it. So don't be afraid to write those bad beginnings. Do write them, just don't keep them there. All right, so lesson 3, don't start with action. This is something that I really wanted to talk about because in order to do this video, like I said, I read a lot of first chapters, but I also watched a lot of first chapter videos. And almost every single one of them said, start with action. And after reading all the first chapters that I did read, not a single book actually started with action. Now, if you can tell, I love hearing popular opinions and then going completely against them. It's what I find fun and trying to figure out my own writing style and why people do things, because quite honestly, I hate just listening to blanketed advice. People saying, don't do this, but not giving me a reason to. And granted, my title is just as bad as what they say. So don't take my title as gospel, please. I don't actually mean don't start with action. So let's talk about what I do mean. The problem isn't really with starting with action. The actual problem is that no one explains what they mean when they say start with action. So let's first talk about the word action. Now, action quite literally means the act of doing something. And if that's the case, then yeah, every single book you read starts with action. Every time a character is walking, talking, taking a breath, they're committing an action. But we all know that's not what action actually means when we're referring to books or movies or any type of media like that. In this case, action is a bit more of an idea. It implies something fast-paced and disruptive, like a fight scene or a chase scene, explosions, basically anything Michael Bay. Now, when you're given the blanket advice of start with action, your brain is going to say, well, at least mine did, start with a chase scene, a fight scene, explosions. But it doesn't really work in a book, does it? Because in a movie or a show, when you start with action, it draws our eyes and our attention in. There's music hyping it up, saying, hey, pay attention to this. Someone's running, they're running into people, they're punching people. Explosions are happening in the background and you are locked in. In a book, it doesn't work that way because, well, we don't have the visuals and we don't have the sound. What we have is words on a page. Now, we have our own strengths. Don't think that it's just a weakness to write a book, because we do have something that media doesn't have. And that is the ability to get deep into your character's thoughts and head and really describe things through their eyes. No type of TV show or movie is ever going to allow you to see directly into that character's mind, not like a book. If you start a book in action, you aren't playing to your strengths as an author. If your character is currently in a fist fight on top of a car going 100 miles per hour down a crowded street, it's going to be kind of hard to explain things like what the city looks like, what it feels like, who the character is, why are they in a fist fight? Do we even like them to care for them to win the fist fight? You see, in a book, an action-packed scene is made interesting by the stakes at hand. Will the hero get hurt? Will the hero save the kid? If we have no idea who the main character is yet, then why do we care what happens to them physically? If we don't know who the character is, then there are no stakes, and therefore a beginning with a fight scene can be almost as boring as I woke up. Now, this isn't to say that you shouldn't start your book with action. I actually read 2 really good first paragraphs that did start with action. The first one being Brandon Sanderson's Steelheart. I skidded down the stairwell and crunched against the steel gravel at the bottom. Sucking in air, I dashed through one of the dark understreets of New Chicago. 10 years had passed since my father's death. That fateful day had become known by most people as the annexation. Now, while our character is running in this scene, and this would be considered action, What is really happening is that he's taking this moment to describe the world around the character. So what the character is doing is merely background while he describes the world and his situation. Now, Edge of the Woods was the other book, and it begins like this. My world began with a single cut. I lowered my stance, gripping my sword tightly, and pronounced my attack. Eightfold dragon obliteration strike. My sword came upward, tearing through the air. The dragon was defeated in an instant, freely spilling its precious lifeblood. This beginning focuses more on the action itself, but doesn't spend too much time on it. Andrew Rowe didn't start the story in the middle of the dragon fight, but at the end of it, because he knew people wouldn't care to sit around for the entire fight when they didn't know who the character was. Instead, this scene works more of a hook to grab our attention. He's just killed a dragon, so now we're sticking around to see what happens next. I will preface again, this doesn't mean don't start your book with action. Just know that you are creating a chaotic, fast-paced scene and have a reason for it. Now that we've talked about why actually starting with action isn't always the correct thing to do, let's actually go over and talk about what people actually mean when they do say start with action. Now, when people say start with action, or start in the middle of your story, or jump right into your story, what they're really saying is start with a hook. I want to be clear that this is very vague, and honestly, I don't like the wording of it at all. A hook implies that you grab someone's attention in the first paragraph so well that they're gonna stick around for the next 400 pages, and that's just not true. That's not what a hook does. All a hook really does is get your audience to ask a question, to make them curious, even if that curiosity only lasts a few more sentences. A first chapter should have a beginning hook and an ending hook. So let's talk about the beginning hook first. The beginning hook usually happens somewhere in the first paragraph or two. Some even have it in the first line. Your inciting incident is gonna naturally be really exciting, so if your story just starts right there in the middle of the inciting incident, then naturally you already have your hook. But as we talked about before, not all stories start with an inciting incident, but we still have to hook our readers. So how do we do that? After a year of slavery in the salt mines of Endovier, Selena Sardothian was accustomed to being escorted everywhere in shackles and at sword point, thrown a glass. This easily strikes a reader's curiosity. They will naturally wonder why and how this girl ended up in this situation and will keep reading to find out. Mistborn begins with, Ash fell from the sky. And it works as a hook. Readers wonder, why is Ash falling from the sky? Did something bad happen? Is this just a natural occurrence in this world? And if it is, why? In Hunger Games, the hook comes from the very first paragraph. Today was the day of the reaping. It's vague, it's mysterious, and it has readers wondering, no, what is the reaping? In Harry Potter and Percy Jackson, the writer hints at something mysterious that's gonna happen, and we keep reading to find out. 4 paragraphs into the Kiss of Deception, and Leah is having her back cut into by knives, and of course, this sparks readers' interest. They want to know why. As you can see, a hook can be a variety of things. It can be an interesting world, an interesting character, an interesting situation, anything that really gets us asking a question of what and why and how. The only thing you don't want to do here is lie to your audience for the sake of a good hook. Dance of Thieves opens up with, the ghosts are still here. The words linger in the air, each one a shimmering spirit, cold whispers of caution. But I wasn't afraid, I already knew. The ghosts, they never go away. This is an awesome first line. I loved this first line because I thought this was going to be a story about a person who could see ghosts, because that's the very first line. Honestly, it has nothing to do with that. And it's still a good book. I enjoyed the book a lot. But every time I read that first line, I am so disappointed by it that it has nothing to do with the rest of the narrative, and it feels like it lied to me. Your hook should always have something to do with the character or the narrative. In Throne of Glass, Selena being a slave is a huge part of who she is. In Hunger Games, the reaping is a huge part of how you get into the games. And in Mistborn, Ash has a connection to the overall goal of the series. After your hook, you still need to keep your audience interested, and this is usually done by describing your character or your setting. Now, we actually already talked about those 2 topics in very much detail over in the other video, so if you want to check it out, the link is in the description. But right now we need to talk about closing out our first chapter, which we need to do with an ending hook. Now, an ending hook is, again, it's the same as the beginning hook. It's just getting your audience to ask a question. Except instead of this time getting them to ask why, we're going to be getting them to ask what's going to happen next. When you end your first chapter, you really want to hook your readers into turning to the next chapter. This can sometimes be considered the cliffhanger or the page turner, and not every first chapter ends like this. but the ones that did really grabbed my attention and had me wanting to read more. Hunger Games ends with Prim being chosen for the Reaping. Steelheart ends with the main character about to attack a supervillain. Percy Jackson ends after he's been attacked by a Fury and no one can remember her. Now, while these cliffhanger endings really grab your attention, you don't have to end like this to have a hook. By this point in the chapter, you might have already introduced interesting elements in the story that will keep your readers reading. In Throne of Glass, the premise is that Selena is the world's greatest assassin and the prince has recently called for her. Now, even though the first chapter didn't end with a hook, I keep reading because I'm interested in what happens with this assassin and prince. And the same for Mistborn. The first chapter really wraps up nicely and there's a conclusion, but in that chapter, they introduce that there's a rebellion rising, people have magic powers, and Vin has a power called luck. This is enough that keeps me reading to the next chapter because I want to figure out what happens. Now, there are some books that don't have any ending hook, and that's still okay. It's just personally for me, I find these the least intriguing. In Wereworld, the beginning hook is that the character is being watched by something. The rest of the chapter is him just explaining that he's a farm boy who isn't as good as his brother, and then it ends with him saying that a storm is on the horizon. Nothing about the first chapter really grabs my attention at all, and there's no really good hooks, but I still read it. It's not a bad book, it just had a weak first chapter. But just because that first chapter wasn't perfect doesn't mean I stopped reading, which is me saying that you can still have a terrible first chapter and still sell tons of copies. So don't panic. Is this more advice for myself? Yes, it is. I make these videos for me as much as I make them for you guys. I've been really struggling with my first chapter and I finally feel like I have something after I did all this research and script writing. And it feels so nice to actually have something on the page. So I hope that I have helped you all write your first chapter or get just something on the page, something written, because that's what this is all about, is getting people into writing more. I just want to say big thanks to my Patreons over here. You guys are so awesome. Thank you guys so much. If you want to check out my Patreon, it is down below. And to the rest of you guys, thank you so much for watching to the end of the video. I hope you guys have a great week and I will see you later. Bye-bye.